So I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our special guest, Paul Kivel. Paul Kivel is a social justice educator, activist, and writer who has worked for 50 years on collective healing, transformation, and justice. Kivel was part of a group that started Surge, showing up for racial justice, and a leader in the anti-racist movement, developing resources for white people working for racial, economic, and gender justice. I know for many of us, Paul's work has been one of our first on-ramps to our own lifelong journey with anti-racist work. That's certainly been the case for me. Your work was the first thing I encountered in college that helped me see myself as a white Jewish woman and where I might have a future in anti-racist work. Kivel is the author of You Call This a Democracy, Men's Work in Helping Teens Stop Violence, Build Community, and Stand for Justice. His most recent books are a revised, updated 4th edition of Uprooting Racism, How White People Can Work for Racial Justice, and Living in the Shadow of the Cross. And there's more about his works on his website, www.paulkivel.com. We are so happy to have you with us tonight, and I believe you already prepared some thoughts about what you would like to share with us about the concept of the buffer zone and how you see it showing up now, and elaborating on that concept for us. And then after Paul speaks, I will be monitoring a Q&A in the chat. So feel free as he's talking and after to share questions that you have in the chat. What I will attempt to do is kind of group together themes and make sure we're addressing as many of the questions as we can in the time that Paul's allowed to spend with us tonight. And without further ado, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. And thank you for all of you for being part of this conversation and the racial justice work you're involved with. I use he, him pronouns. I'm on Wee-Chin, which is Chochenyo Ohlone land, also known as Oakland, California. And I thought I would just put out a few thoughts that hopefully will provoke more conversation and dive a little deeper into the concept of the buffer zone, but also particularly in terms of the ever-changing context that this structure functions within, and particularly the pandemic, of course, but also more generally in a time of climate emergency, economic collapse, and the collapse of the the US empire. So we're also in the midst of a presidential election. And so we always have to think about the larger context and ask the question of whether what we're doing is commensurate with the scale of the challenges we face. And one thing about the buffer zone is that it hones us in to very small scale of the work that we can feel good about, but it doesn't necessarily contribute to the larger struggles for racial, gender, economic, and other forms of justice. So there's a couple of questions that always guide me in my work, and I just wanted to toss them out very briefly for you to share them with you. The first question is, what do I stand for? And it's a question about, what are the values that I hold? What kind of person am I? Am I trustworthy? Am I a person of integrity? Am I honest? Do I treat people with respect? And in a society like ours that is based on competition and individualism, that it's always important to check in with ourselves on that question. How are we holding to the values that we really want to live by? But the second question that we don't ask as much, which I think is at least as important, is who do we stand with? Who do I stand with? So I want to say a little bit about that because it's really speaks to the beginning of my racial justice journey. Back in the late 1960s at a small college in the Northwest, And in my senior year, there were a whole group of Black students from various parts of the country. We were kind of brought into this predominantly, overwhelmingly white campus. And after a few months on the campus, they took over the administration building because they realized that they could not get any kind of education in the college as it was, as a predominantly white college, predominantly white staff, predominantly white curricula. And so a few of us wanted to support them. And so we went to some of the leaders of this group and we asked, what can we do? How can we support what you're trying to do here? And they said, well, we have two basic needs. We need some solidarity. We need people to bring in some food and other supplies, to send out messages, to, do basic logistical support, basically. And we said, fine, we can set up systems to do that. But then they said, we also need you to talk to white people on this campus because they don't have a clue about what's going on and why we're here and what we're asking for. And that was a much harder request to respond to because I realized I didn't really know how to talk about racism. I didn't know how to talk to other white people, and it felt scary and daunting, and it felt like I would compromise my pure place as a good white person if I associated with those other white people. But that was an important check-in for me about, did I really stand with the African-American students in this struggle? Was I willing to reach out and actually work with white people? So this question of, well, who do we stand with, I think is a question that if we're working in the buffer zone or talking about the buffer zone, it's one kind of litmus test that I'll come back to in a little bit about accountability. And the question I raised in the article is who benefits from the work we do. It's another way of formulating that question. So I don't want to go through the article or the concepts of the article, but I do want to say how important the intersectional analysis of the buffer zone is. That I talk in the article a little bit about race and class, well, a lot about class and somewhat about race and gender, but it's not accidental that so many of you on this call are either white females or white queer and trans folks. Because a lot of the work of the buffer zone, especially the caretaking, service provision of the buffer zone, has been traditionally white women's work. The way that white women are socialized and trained, not just to take care of white men, but to actually serve functions within the entire system of white supremacy. So it's really important to look at how that works. Another crucial role of the buffer zone is control of people at the bottom of the pyramid. And that has more to do with the socialization of white men to be tough and aggressive and in control and to fulfill the roles to maintain the system as it is, especially as people protest and resist and organize on different principles. And of course, I suggested an article in prep for this discussion, which really speaks very specifically to the racial dynamics of the buffer zone. The fact that this is a way for so many white people to be in roles in the guise of providing services to people, communities of color and people of color, and also to low-income white people, to maintain a racial hierarchy about who gets in leadership, who has access to information, who maintains control. So the buffer zone is obviously more complex than that article indicated. So I just want to say a couple of things about that. For instance, we can look at different tiers of the buffer zone. At the top of the buffer zone is really the foundations set up by the ruling class directly. So the foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or the Ford or Rockefeller foundations, the money laundering enterprises that allows now billionaires to actually influence public policy and foreign policy and have tremendous reach through their foundations and through their funding of various nonprofits and NGOs. Below that is the top tier of the kind of nonprofit industrial industry, nonprofit, industrial structure. And that would be the colleges, the hospitals, the elite cultural organizations, and the more powerful Christian religious organizations that that actually control most of the wealth that's managed in the buffer zone. So I think the most recent numbers I've seen that the elite nonprofits, the top 2.5% of organizations, have over 50% of the wealth and bring in over 60% of the charity's annual revenues in the United States. So when we talk about nonprofits, we have to really distinguish between that elite sphere of nonprofits who are mostly providing services to elite families and communities, Harvard and Yale and private hospitals and things like that, to the remaining 1/3 of what we would consider more kind of local nonprofits or national nonprofits who don't have such big budgets and are always struggling year to year to get funded. And they're really dividing up about 13% of the annual revenues and 11% of the assets in the buffer zone. So that's important to keep in mind in terms of how we think about this, I think. In terms of the pandemic, obviously the need for immediate services is pretty overwhelming at this point. And one of the things the buffer zone always has done is to keep people's attentions on the provision of immediate services and to have people compete over those services and that money and funding. And that's certainly happening now. And that keeps our attention on the trickle down from the economic system and not on the concentration of wealth at the top. And we know that there's unprecedented concentration at the top of the pyramid. We have a few hundred richest people in the United States who have as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the population. In fact, there are now 6 white Christian men who have as much wealth as the bottom half of US society. That's how extreme the inequalities of wealth have become, but it also means that our attention can't stay only on who's at the bottom of the pyramid and who's needing services. We have to be addressing those structural inequalities. So I think that the buffer zone was always created to alleviate stress on the system, to co-opt grassroots leadership by promoting people into buffer zone leadership roles, and overall to prevent organizing by splitting people, putting people's interests against each other, all of which supports the status quo. I think also in this time of neoliberalism, it's also designed to discredit government in general so that people don't trust government to provide services. And so they're constantly having to look to alternatives, and that's often privatized. It goes with the privatization of our schools and healthcare systems and prison systems and everything else. And it's also become an avenue for Christian organizations to get more government support for their activities of providing services with the long-term goal of accumulating more wealth and power, and at the same time continuing their missionary and proselytizing work in various communities throughout the country. So those, I didn't speak to those in the original article, but I think those are also really important roles. And we see a lot of work, especially by Christian organizations, to gain access to government funding to support their proselytizing and other religiously related work. And so that's an important thing to notice and pay attention to. So a couple of things I just want to conclude with before we throw it open to questions is that, so what do we do? Especially since so many of us end up in jobs in the buffer zone in one way or another. I think one thing that's important for me is to separate my political work from my work in nonprofit organizations or in the buffer zone. It's not that that work is not good work. It's not that we can't feel good about what we do in those jobs, but that if we're really, the buffer zone was set up to support the status quo. And so if we don't support the status quo, it's not going to be in our job descriptions to change things, to challenge the status quo. So the work we need to do as activists and organizers is often outside of our buffer zone work. You know, the jobs that may be sustaining us and bringing home income to support our families. We need to separate that from thinking about what is our real political work in the community. And that can look in lots of different ways. It doesn't have to look one way, but it's much harder if we're conflating and becoming complacent about our work in nonprofits as our political work, because very often it's not. But since many of us are in nonprofit organizations and in the buffer zone in various ways, I think we can do some good work there, but we need to be subversive. Like I said, it's not part of our job descriptions to change our organizations or institutions. So that means we have to be organizing from the inside, working with people on the outside of our organizations to actually push a progressive or radical agenda. And if we do that too explicitly, then we get fired or isolated and marginalized. So it's not just that we have to be subversive, but we have to be strategically subversive. That means we have to think about what we can and can't do, who our allies are within the organization and outside of the organization, what kind of leverage do we have for making change, and then strategically work with others to actually use that leverage to make changes. In all of this, it comes back, I think, to the questions that the question I asked in the beginning about who do I stand with, and it's really the question about accountability. And so for me, there's levels. Accountability could take us a whole nother couple of hours to talk about at least, but I want to say that there's individual levels of accountability that we can set up in terms of thinking about who actually oversees or looks at what we're doing and gives us feedback, political feedback on whether we're doing it accountably, whether we're doing it in terms of supporting the grassroots, the leadership of grassroots social justice campaigns and movements. But it's just as important that our organizations be accountable. And that means accountable to organizations in the community, those organized by people at the bottom of the economic pyramid, so that we are taking leadership from, rather than providing resources and leadership for, the communities that we most want to be in support of. And there's lots of good resources about that, but I just want to end on that note of we really have to put accountability in the center of our practice, both individually and organizationally, if we hope to do effective racial justice and other forms of social justice work. So I have about 10 to 12 minutes. I'd like to open it up to questions and answers, questions. And I don't know if somebody on your team wants to facilitate that or
I'm
how you
going to
want to
take
manage it.
the
But
lead in doing that. I think you hit on a couple of the key questions I heard come up for our group when we last talked about this conversation. And right now, I think there's a big question that comes forward to a lot of people, like, is the nonprofit sector, are these helping professions basically doomed? Maybe take us out of some of our like search for an either or thinking of, can this be reformed from within, or do we need to completely abolish it? How do you approach that?
well, I think that we need to have a vision of two different aspects of how we take care of each other in our communities. One is a model of mutual aid, and how do we actually care for each other and engage in process of healing and transformative justice that are not dependent on large organizations or outside organizations of our communities. But at the other end, we also need to build a governmental structure that provides the basic needs of our communities. We need national health care for all. We need national public education, accessible and high quality for everyone, things like that. So we need, at the one hand, we need a robust government structure of providing resources from the taxes of those who have money. And we need not to rely on that exclusively and build the local, interpersonal, grassroots, mutual aid, transformative justice processes that really count about where we take care of ourselves. There's a really good book, recent book by Zach Norris called We Keep Us Safe. And it talks a lot about these issues and how do we actually envision a society in which we're not dependent on a nonprofit sector because that is going to be inherently limited and built around sustaining the economic system.
Thank you. Another big thing that has come up, and you hit this on the nose, a lot of us work in these professions. So I think the question becomes really personal about how we could think about taking up these roles and what that means for our own futures and well-being as professionals. The specific question someone asked in the group was, can you give like a concrete example of a political role you've seen people play effectively from within the buffer zone, like specific action steps or examples?
Okay, sure. Well, some of you are familiar with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond based in New Orleans. And they are a Black-led racial justice education and organizing group that's been around for a long time. And they started doing a lot of training of social workers because they recognize that social workers, they use the terminology, are gatekeepers for services for communities of color. And so they started doing trainings around the country, focus on many different groups of people, but one particular focus was on social workers. They did a lot of trainings in the state of New York, and those people who were trained got together in a network and started thinking about the New York State Social Service Department as a whole. And they started organizing within that to start to shift the culture and the practices of social work in the state of New York. And they've had quite a bit of success in some ways. They have changed policies. They have trained a vast cadre of folks who have gone through racial justice training so that they're now operating out of different principles and practices. And they've kept the issue of racial inequalities and inequities forefront in social work training as well as in social work practice. So that's an example of how it's a long-term work. It's, this is work that's been going on for probably 20 years now, but you can have significant impact if you are strategic and building and expanding your network of allies and persistent.
I think we have like 1 minute left, and this is a question that's not a 1 minute question, which is how do we get some of our focus on the top of the pyramid? Like, what are some of the ways that we can do that, especially if we're in these buffer zone roles?
Well, I think political education is a key piece of that. If we're providing housing services of some sort, we need to be talking about who controls housing and why is there not enough housing, and how is development happening and decisions being made in that area. If we're talking about hunger, if we're providing food to folks who don't have food, we need to be talking about agribusiness and corporate practices around food. If we're talking about, whatever kind of services we're talking about, we need to be educating people on how the institutions and systems are set up to perpetuate, inequality and racism and sexism in particular, so that people begin to understand, because we live in a culture where people blame themselves for their problems. That's part of the dominant Christian value. If you're poor, you must have done something wrong. You've been lazy or slothful or something, because hard work is rewarded. Well, we know that's not true, but we have to give people a political framework for understanding the situation they're in, and what are the collective forces that working against them, and what is the history of organizing in which people come together to address those kinds of issues. So I think the political education is a really key part of that. And then the other part is just old-fashioned organizing. Going out and talking to folks and finding out what they're concerned about and what challenges they face, and building avenues for folks to come together and start to take leadership and work out a vision of what they'd like to see, and addressing the issues in front of them. So political education and organizing.
I can't thank you enough for spending your time with us. If people want to take their mics off mute and just give a round of applause or do spirit fingers or however we can show our group appreciation, this is a real treat. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to continue the conversation with anybody. I'm at paul@paulkivel.com. And there's lots of resources on my website, as was mentioned earlier, just paulkivel.com. So keep the conversation going and think about how to apply